This is a recording. JTNT Neo Kobe.
You know, I've been thinking. The landscape of portable gaming has changed a considerable amount, even in just the past 10 or 15 years. Every device has Wi-Fi, rechargeable batteries, Bluetooth, and even backlit screens. It's hard to believe that only 10 years... Wait a minute.
Never made it as a wise man. I couldn't cut it as a poor man stealing.
Oh, God. 20 years? Sorry, time kinda stopped moving for me ever since 2010 came around. 'Cause the world has kinda just been shit ever since.
Skittles, that's enough. Please. I hate tickles.
Anyways, it's hard to believe that not too long ago, these device essentials were luxuries. And if you wanted a piece of that multiplayer pie or wireless cake, you had to buy entire add-ons in order to do so. Lots of stuff under this umbrella came out in the GBA years, but they existed as far back as the OG Game Boy. Which brings us to today's topic, link cables. The Game Boy Link cable was the first accessory released for the Game Boy line, iconically being used to link two systems together in order to play Tetris. The connector of this cable is a proprietary one, which was the common practice for most Nintendo things up until the Switch, really. The cable itself isn't very advanced, it just sends and receives data when the game cartridge tells it to do so. Not many games actually communicate in real time, though real-time multiplayer would become more common when the GBA came out. Anyways, I recently picked up two Game Boy Pockets. I added a backlight and a power regulator to one, and left the other one unmodded. While admiring my hoard of useless junk, I figured now that I have two Game Boys, why not have the two communicate with each other? It was at that moment, an ancient memory flashed into my head, seeing that cable hanging out in the bargain bin of a Kmart.
Which cable?
You say as I cradle your little goblin body. I'm talking about these little guys right here, the Kemco Pikachu Link cable, for use with Game Boy Compact Video System. As the name suggests, this is a Game Boy Link cable that connects through the brains and brawn of this dynamic Pikachu duo. God knows what these guys are actually doing to link two Game Boys together. They sit on these futuristic Twix bars, jack into your Game Boy, and boom! They're talking to each other, and so are your Game Boys. Now, in reality, there's nothing special about the actual hardware of this cable. It's just a standard Game Boy Color / Game Boy Pocket Link cable. So, you're probably thinking,
I absolutely need
Fucking Pikachu! Why?
well, if you want these little dudes, be prepared to shell out a bit of cash. They're not extremely expensive, but they're just expensive enough to be hard to justify when you're a man-child in denial such as myself. So, I compulsively stalked eBay like a homeless man eyeing the taquito warmer at 7-Eleven, waiting for an unwanted and unloved one to end up in my desperate little hands. Eventually, that day came. I stumbled upon a listing for these fellas, and woof, they weren't looking too hot. The paint on these things scratched off over time, and it's been a decent chunk of time for these guys to start having male pattern baldness. The Pokeball bit of the cable wasn't looking too hot either, the red paint being nothing more than speckled, faded paint. The listing was up for 20 quid, which, for a cheapskate like me, was just too much for these abused Pikachus. I shot the seller an offer of £12, and to my surprise, they accepted. Just in time too, as I had just purchased a few Japanese Game Boy cards, some of them having link port functionality. Sexy! While I waited for them to arrive, I had an epiphany. Why don't I try restoring them? I've watched a few videos of people restoring old vintage toys. The dirt and age rubbed away with soap, touching it up with a bit of fresh paint. Most of what they used was just some paint, soap, and actual talent. I had all but the last part, but I still wanted to give it a shot. So I eagerly awaited for the Pikachus to come to my doorstep, fantasizing about how great they'll look all spruced up. As soon as they were delivered, I grabbed my camera and started to record. Taking them out of the bag, I realized their condition wasn't as bad as the pictures made it out to be. I was expecting the yellow of the plastic to be more pale and faded, but it was still pretty bright and punchy, though the same couldn't be said about their faces. Both Pikachus had messed up eyes, they were both missing the whites in their left eye, and the black off their ears had been scratched off. One of them was worse than the other, most of the paint on his ears being gone. They also both didn't have a nose, which was a blessing in disguise, as they had that fresh eBay stank, smelling vaguely of dust and smoke. It was at this point that I decided to name them. The one on the left is Bimmy, and the one on the right is Jimmy. I like to think that Jimmy is the little brother between the two. There I go, projecting onto inanimate objects again. Before beginning the restoration process, I decided to see if the link cable even worked in its current state. So, I whipped out my Game Boy Pockets, my Easy Flash, and Bokujo Monogatari GB2, aka Harvest Moon 2 for all you gaijins out there. I've been trying to play this game as research for my own Game Boy game I'm working on, and I've recently started learning Japanese, so this game being in hiragana helps with that. Also helps that a box copy of the Japanese version is as much as a loose, scratched up English version. I fucking love buying retro games and losing all my money. So I booted up the two consoles. The silver one had the Easy Flash with the Japanese ROM on it, and the red one was my legit copy. Everything was going fine until I got to the title screen and my save was gone. I had to put the link test on hold and check on the save battery. The soldering job wasn't too pretty, so I cleaned it up a bit and the game was saving again. With that minor annoyance aside, I tried again, and bada bing, we were in, baby. Bimmy and Jimmy were watching over the screens, apparently being bilingual, as they had no problem speaking in Japanese. It had been a while since I used the link cable, and I forgot that feeling of excitement when everything works. The cable itself can be a bit flaky at times, but once it's all up and running, seeing two Game Boys communicate in real time is magical. The idea that this cable is streaming information through a physical means is so novel to me. It's a feeling that is a bit lost now, what with everything being wireless or Bluetooth. There's magic in that feeling too. I remember when I played Mario Kart DS online for the first time. It blew my mind to be able to have my ass beaten by dudes in other countries while I sat free Wi-Fi from McDonald's. Getting back on track, the cable works, and just for laughs, I decided to try trading for my American ROM with my Japanese cartridge. Now, when you do this with the Game Boy Pokemon games, this can cause a lot of problems, due to the structure of Pokemon working a bit differently between the worldwide and Japanese releases. But trading in Harvest Moon GB2 seems to be fine. The Japanese text doesn't show up on the English version, but interestingly, it translated the Japanese name correctly. I had used the character A, which had showed up as A when trading. Bimmy and Jimmy helped me to trade some asparagus seeds, which is about as exciting as you might imagine. But that's besides the point. Everything is working, now it's time to prep these lads for painting. Now, a short disclaimer, I am not a professional. If you're watching this video as a tutorial, God knows why you are, then please don't follow my actions. I've never done anything like this before. The closest experience I have to doing this would be painting Gunpla, which is the logic I was applying to this project. The paint I wanted to use is made specifically for Gunpla, and it's called G-Paint. G-Paint is a lacquer-based paint. Its advantages are that it comes pre-thinned and doesn't require any primer, making it easy for you to just get up and start painting. I had a brief gig where I was a B2B salesman for this product, so I had a case of the stuff sitting around collecting dust. There are a few caveats to using G-Paint. One is that it's primarily used for airbrushing, which wasn't what I was planning on doing. I wanted to hand paint these suckers since they're so small. Now you can hand paint with G-Paint, but the results won't be as good as when compared to airbrushing. The second issue was that this stuff stinks. And I don't just mean that nice fumy smell you get from your baby daddy's game workshop paint. I mean G-Paint is pretty damn toxic. I had both windows open on a windy day with a respirator, and even then I came out of this experience with a headache and other symptoms. I'm not holding that against the paint itself, I'm just putting it out there. Anyways, the colors we needed were red for the Pokeball and Pikachu's cheeks, black for Pikachu's ears and eyes, and white for the eye shines. To prevent my shaky hands from spilling paint onto other parts that didn't need it, we're using some good old frog tape. No idea if this is the standard of what. I mean, frogs are just my favorite animal, so I went with this one. I began applying the masking tape to the Pokeball, cutting pieces with a craft knife and applying them all over the plastic pieces. After that was done, I started painting the top of the Pokeball, lightly brushing dabs of red on the thing. I had started a bit too thick for the initial layer, but it was a start nonetheless. I then got our boy Jimmy, and poked his cheeks with that same red paint. Again, splashing a bit too much, but I was hoping to go back and clean off any excess paint later on. After that, I broke up the black paint and got to work on painting Bimmy's ears. It was at that point where I subconsciously began to realize that my masking job was terrible, but my naivety caused me to press on. Now that I had the two of them looking like interrogation victims, I decided to let them dry and cure overnight, around 18 hours in total. The next day, I woke up, and before even having my morning coffee, I tore into these boys like a British TV presenter. But I was greeted with this, a streaky, splotchy mess. Bimmy and Jimmy were smiling, but I knew it was only for my sake. I took a deep breath, and whipped out the ever so reliable 99% rubbing alcohol, and got to work cleaning these guys up. It took a long time, and even more Q-tips, but eventually I got them back to a decent state. That was until I accidentally rubbed off the brown spots on Jimmy's back. Stupidity aside, I moved on to attempt number 2. This time we were going to do things a bit differently. The G-paint was out of the picture. I traded it for the classic Tamiya acrylic paint, paired with some gray Tamiya primer. I also had some generic acrylic paint sitting around, so I decided to use that for the back and the eye shines. I got to work reapplying the masking tape with the twins. After about 30 minutes of scraping tape off some rats, we made it. So I took the boys outside with a can of primer in tow, placing them on some cardboard. As soon as I got to spraying, the rain was slowly coming down. I remember in school there was this kid who used to tell me, when it rains, God is crying. Well, God must have a lot to cry about in Scotland, because it rained pretty much every damn day this entire process. Since I had to run inside to make sure rain didn't get on our freshly primed pieces, I ended up missing a few spots. I tried not to let that get in my way, and soon set up my workstation, equipped with Tamiya thinner and brushes this time. I poured some paint onto my palette and dropped some thinner into each pot, mixing it around with the paint. The strategy here was to apply several thin coats of paint, letting each coat dry for about 30 minutes in between coats. It's a slow burner, but it was worth it for the peace of mind you'd receive by not ending up with a blob of thick paint after 20 hours. For the white spots, I used a needle which broke off a pin that I had, dipping it in white paint and lightly jabbing it into their eyes. It was hard to get the camera to focus in this video, but I feel like this part was the most egregious. A few hours later, Bimmy and Jimmy were ready to dry overnight yet again. The two sat on my desk and looked at me as I watched random clips from Babylon 5. Their gaze was painful. I did not know whether I was hurting them or helping them, and I wouldn't find out until the next morning. I tossed and turned in my bed that night, saddened by the fate of these poor, pudgy Pikachus. The sun came up, and I was pretty nervous. I could tell that the paint had cured, but the red on the cheeks had spilled a bit too much onto the tape. There was no point in worrying about the past. Bimmy and Jimmy needed to be freed from this masking tape prison. So, Bimmy was first, and Jesus Christ. It looked like he had been jumped for being a juggalo. Blood and face paint smeared across his body. Before I even got to Jimmy, I started cleaning Bimmy. I felt that I owed it to him. I put him in this critical state. After hundreds of Q-tips, I then went for Jimmy, who wasn't as bad as his brother. His face looked pretty good, but his ears were an absolute mess. Same for his back. It was at this point where I had to make a tough decision. I could either try painting again, or I could take the poor man's way out using a Sharpie. After much deliberation, I took the latter, seeing as I would have to prime the Pikachus again, which was only going to accentuate the scratches and gouges already on those poor bastards. And I'm impatient and lazy. So, I threw out the singular grain of pride I had left and got to drawing. As I dotted Bimmy's eyes, I realized the Sharpie didn't look all that bad. Well, in small doses anyway. My strategy now was to clean off the remaining excess paint, and use my Sharpies to color in when needed. It was an oddly nostalgic process. As a kid, I used to make custom Legos with Sharpie. I remember making a custom Mega Man minifigure using an X-Wing helmet and a blue Sharpie. It wasn't pretty, but it made me happy. Totally not foreshadowing. It hurt my heart to see these little guys covered in ink, but you know, I think it hurt my heart even more breathing in toxic paint fumes for 3 days. In the middle of my Sharpie chagrin, a parcel arrived, containing something of which would become unexpectedly relevant to this video. I had ordered some Japanese copies of Pokemon Red and Silver, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier, learning Japanese, costs, etc. I also ordered this crappy GBA magnifier light thing, but that's irrelevant. While I was testing out the cartridges, something unexpected happened. The copy of Pokemon Red still had a save on it. Now, for those who don't know, the save battery on these things die over time, usually lasting around 10 years or so, if you're lucky. But some people's batteries last way longer than that. I had bought these with no guarantee that the batteries worked, let alone that they even saved to begin with. Amazingly, we can see here that this cart belonged to Taiga, who played for 15 hours. They had some Pokemon on here, including a Charizard and an Articuno. For me, this is an awesome find. I love going through old save files. It's fun to go back in time and try to imagine what kind of person was playing the game. But then I began to worry. This cart might be using an OEM battery, which has gotta be on its last legs. These batteries have a 3-volt voltage. Anything in the 3.0s is healthy, but the lower it gets, the higher the chance you have of losing your saves forever. I decided to check the battery with the multimeter, and while it wasn't completely drained, it was low enough to make me concerned. At that moment, this project turned into something more. This project wasn't just for me, or for Bimmy, or even for little Jimmy. It was now a matter of preservation. The fact that I had the opportunity to preserve someone else's memories, that made this project all the more special. My plan now was to play through the copy of Pokemon Silver up to Ecruteak City in order to gain access to Bill's time machine. I'd played through the Johto games hundreds of times, and it wasn't going to be any trouble, even in Japanese. The only part that had me sweating was the voltage on that cartridge. It was like a ticking time bomb. It could be fine for the next 10 years, or it could die the next time you boot it up. So I got to work, blasting through Johto, catching random Pokemon to build up a trade supply like some kind of weird 8-bit human trafficker. In between my playthrough, I decided to be brave and dot the whites of Pikachu's eyes. I didn't have a white Sharpie, and I wasn't going to use paint again, so I decided to use a white Posca marker I had lying around. Posca claims to adhere to plastic, and what do you know, it worked. Took me quite a few attempts though, having to rub out Bimmy's eyes about 50 times before I got it to look somewhat decent. I bet you thought I forgot about the Pokeball. Well, I did, but for good reason. It was a mess, so I said fuck it, removed all the paint, and turned it into a Premier Ball. I'm lucky that my favorite Pokeball just happens to be the easiest one to recreate. From then on, it was back to speedrunning Silver. Got Japanese Pokemon Silver with some Seaman. My Seaman's about to give birth. Come on, you can do it. Oh.
My work here is done. Later.
He's just dead? Oh my god. By the evening, I had gotten the time machine, and now I needed to wait 24 hours in order to fully unlock it. I never really understood why this was a requirement, but that worked out for me, because I had a Game Boy Color that I needed to restore as well. You can check out that video here. After waiting an entire day's worth of time, continuing to let the Game Boy brain rot consume me, it was time to put an end to this. Bimmy and Jimmy were ready. They had been through so much hell and paint poisoning to get to this point. There was only one more thing left to do to them, giving them their tiny little noses back, which had long since been rubbed off. I thought this would be the hardest part, given that the area to dot was minute, but we got it on the first try. Now all that was left to do was set up our Game Boys. I inserted the copy of Pokemon Red into the Red system, and take a wild guess where I put the copy of Pokemon Silver. With our boys attached to our Game Boys, both games at the Pokemon Center, all that was left was just to hit those 8 buttons. You know, I won't lie, seeing these two games communicate was just awesome. Going beyond the nostalgia factor, I just think it's cool from a tech perspective. The fact that these little machines can trade data with one another and save them onto cartridges. The trade animations for the older Pokemon games are so fun too. There's something very satisfying watching the Pokemon travel down the cable and pop out of this little tube. Such a creative way to mask what is otherwise a pretty simple process. That's something that these older Pokemon games did very well. That level of presentation and charm made them stand out to me when I was a brainless child. And even now as a brainless man-child. For about 30 minutes, I collected all of Taiga's Pokemon, and sent over a few filler ones I caught. It's a good thing Taiga wasn't actually here to stop me. I'd imagine they'd be pretty pissed off if they knew I traded their Articuno for a Bellsprout. Once I transferred the final Pokemon, I left the trade room, leaving Taiga stuck in purgatory, forcing me to reset. From here, Taiga's Pokemon will make one last journey, and that's to Hake, a random Japanese Pokemon red save I found online. This save was going to go on my flashcard, so then I could extract the PK1 files in PKHex, fully preserving Taiga's Pokemon in the rawest format possible. After that second set of trades were done, I did exactly that. I opened the save in PKX and began to save all of Taiga's Pokemon. I've done this process before, but it's always a bit surreal to see the files by the end of it. These tiny little files are Pokemon. They traveled long and far from 1996 to 2023, from Japan to the UK, and now they're forever memorialized on my hard drive. In terms of individual Pokemon, they're nothing special. They're not shiny, they're not rare, but they have a historical and sentimental value, at least in my eyes. With that being said, that's where Bimmy, Jimmy, and Taiga's stories end, at least for now. I still need to replace the battery on the red card, and I'll definitely be doing some more link cable shenanigans at some point. It was a fun ride, and while the results with the restoration were far from perfect, I never expected for a perfect result. If I really wanted a pristine and perfect Chemco Pikachu cable, I could've just bought one. I find more value in making memories with these items, making them into something more than obsolete junk rotting away on eBay. If you're still watching, first off, holy shit. You can't see it, but I'm praising you on my hands and knees. I love you so much. But yeah, if you're still watching, if you have an old toy, electronic, or anything else you want to give a bit of TLC to, do it. Even if it ends up a bit messy, you'll have a story to tell, and a one-of-a-kind item on your hands. But that's all from Bimmy, Jimmy, and I. They've earned a break in, so have I. So, if you'll excuse me, I've installed a link port into my brain, and I'll now be trading my 20 kilobyte brain save file for a Krabby. Thanks for watching.